The passing of actor, activist, and entertainer Chadwick Boseman was a wake-up call to many within the African American community and the world. His passing made us wake up to the fact that no one is immune to disease, not even the King of Wakanda, the Godfather of Soul, Mr. Civil Rights, or Number 42. Chadwick Boseman's passing hurt our community once again because, like the passing of a family member, someone who has touched our hearts with such immense talent was now gone. Today, the slave food doctors are joined by Dr. Ed McDonald, a board-certified gastroenterologist and culinary chef, to discuss the tragic premature death of Chadwick Boseman and the impact of colon cancer in the Black community. Dr. Edwin McDonald is a gastroenterologist who specializes in the conditions of the body's digestive system. He attended Northwestern University, Feinberg School of Medicine, as well as interned at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. He received his board certifications in internal medicine and began his practice in 2011. Dr. McDonald is an active educator and advocate for nutrition. His participation in Project Brotherhood propelled his mission from activism in nutritional education. This medical center assists African American men by supplying them with accessible and affordable care. He is a man of many impactful accomplishments, such as spreading awareness of nutritional effects on health and disease. You can find out more information about Dr. McDonald through his website, thedocskitchen.com. Welcome, Dr. McDonald and everyone, to today's show.
Oh, thanks for having me.
All right, thanks, Danette. Man, glad to have you. It's glad to have you on this show today. We were just chatting backstage really about how we first met, but I'd be amiss. I have to be honest. I don't normally get impacted by the death of movie stars or superstars, but this one actually kind of hit me at home. And I'll be honest. We were sitting up a week ago today, and we learned about his passing, and we had commented that he appeared a bit thin in the months leading up to his passing. And it really just struck me. And over the ensuing hours, we started kind of watching. We watched his commencement speech at Howard University. We watched his dedication and comments to Denzel Washington. And what struck me was really that this young man, and I call him young because I'm older than him, right, when he passed away, was really carrying around a burden. And yet this burden that he carried, this luggage, this issue that was there, did not stop him from pursuing his passion. So amidst everything else, while he filmed Black Panther, while he filmed 42, we know he likely suffered with colon cancer. And so it was in that moment that we were just like, you know what, we need to educate ourselves. We need to educate the community at large. And really in a very similar fashion for myself, like after my own dad passed away, I felt like, listen, I need to do something to honor his memory in terms of providing education and resources and letting folks know that there has the potential to be a better way. There's no guarantees in life, but it gives them an option. And so, man, I reached out to you, and this speaks volumes to who you are, because immediately, I didn't even have your email, I don't think, or maybe I did. I emailed you, I reached out to you on social media, and you were like, yeah, I'm down. Whatever you need, I'm there. And so I appreciate you, man, for coming on and highly acclaimed gastroenterologist out of Chicago, coming on and joining us.
Well, I appreciate you too, also, and vice versa. I mean, with the passing of Chadwick Boseman, I mean, this is like you just said, it touched me personally, and I mean, this is someone that my kids looked up to. When the movie Black Panther came out, you know, my kids were excited about having to see the opportunity to see a black superhero and a predominantly black cast, and
Yeah.
you know, even outside of his role, it is he played so many important roles in such a short period of time. I mean, we're really talking about a career that spanned what the past 8 years or so, if that long. And you know, almost every role that was prominent was something that's very impactful and something that's noticeable. Um, so when I heard he passed, especially at the age of 43, I mean, we're within the same age cohort, so we would have been in high school at the same time. And it's something that struck me because I've seen multiple young people, especially men of color, pass at early ages from colon cancer, and I've heard so many horror stories about diagnoses that should have been made, but they weren't made for a lot of different reasons. So when you came to me and said you want to talk about this, I was already primed and ready to go and talk about it.
Appreciate that, Eric.
Man, let me tell you something. I think I really enjoyed him as an actor, but I as someone who does a lot of public speaking, watched his commencement speech for Howard University and was floored. I was blown away.
Oh.
And also when he gave kudos to Denzel, and I realized this guy isn't just an actor. This guy's a communicator. And the depth to which he spoke in both cases, and there are other times that I've listened to him talk and stuff and seen him, not playing a role. I mean, so he was a powerful individual. It affected me just because, I mean, this is why we do what we do at Slave Food. In order to try and prevent early deaths. But it really hurt me. And I think, like you said, I mean, this is an honor of him, just to try and talk about a tough subject, and to give whatever we can around prevention, that's possible, because, this is tough. And the last thing I'll say is this: the fortitude to film, Hollywood blockbuster movies while dealing with this speaks volumes to this man's character and grit. And I just wish I had that. I wish all of us had that. It speaks a lot. So he gets props. And let's talk about the disease. Let's talk about what we can do to prevent it, and what we as African Americans, we're at risk. We all are, and so it's a conversation that needs to be had.
Definitely. What's interesting about this is that when we looked and we started out, and we always reflect on this, we were kind of sitting around a table, just kind of talking, as many people of every ethnic group we do. You sit around and you just communicate. We were having a conversation. One of our college roommates, or our college friends from back in the day, named Joseph McKenzie, a lawyer inside the East Coast, prominent, he actually said, what's the deal with Black people? Why do I have to have a colonoscopy faster than my colleagues? And that really was the birthplace of slave food. It really was born out of that conversation, out of that question, amongst other questions. So speak to that. Why is it? What's the deal?
Yeah, so I mean, the studies indicate that for African Americans or people of African descent in America, because folks of African descent outside of America may actually do a little bit better when it comes to colon cancer. But here in America, people who've been raised on the standard American diet and also raised within the context of America, so that's also experiencing racism, experiencing a lot of things that can come along with the Black experience in America. But as a result, we have higher rates of colorectal cancer. Okay, so it may be 20% higher in terms of the actual incidence of getting colorectal cancer, but we also have rates 40% higher in terms of actually dying from colon cancer. And those numbers can vary from city to city. So in Chicago, where I'm currently located, Black people are 2 times higher at risk for dying from colon cancer than non-Hispanic white people. So there's a big gap. So originally, when people were looking at some of this literature and looking at some of these disparities, one of the possible solutions was increasing or moving up the age in which people can get colon cancer screening to age 45 from age 50. Now, recently, there's been a movement to even move that age up for all Americans, not just Black Americans, but all Americans. And at this point, the American Cancer Society actually recommends that everyone 45 and up get colonoscopy or colon cancer screening. Now, some of our other societies are still at that age 50 cutoff, but I have a feeling that it may move up to age 45 for everyone because colon cancer in general is increasing in the population of people under the age of 50. So one of the best ways to identify that and prevent people from actually dying from colon cancer is definitely early detection.
So Dr. McDonald, speak a little bit about screening. So
Yeah.
break it down for our listeners really about what screening means. Does it mean solely the colonoscopy, or tell us about that?
So it doesn't mean solely the colonoscopy. I mean, colonoscopy is definitely the screening method of choice for us gastroenterologists because that's the service that we provide. However, there are other alternatives. So one of the reasons why I prefer colonoscopy is primarily because if we find polyps, which are small growths that in some people over many years can turn into a colon cancer, with the colonoscopy, that is the only intervention that we can actually remove the polyp, thereby removing the risk of actually developing colon cancer. Whereas some of the other modalities, the screening tools that we use, they are pretty good for identifying issues, but they don't really treat anything, and you still have to end up having a colonoscopy. So with screening, outside of colonoscopy, your options are CT colonography, which is a special CT scan. Now, the issue with the CT colonography, you still have to drink the bowel preparation, all the liquid that cleans you out. And for most people, I don't know if anyone in this room's had a colonoscopy, it's really the bowel preparation that's probably the most difficult portion of the procedure, not the actual colonoscopy itself. So, majority of my patients are 100% comfortable when it comes to colonoscopy. I even have a lot of people who actually prefer to be awake for a colonoscopy, and I can do, yeah. So, I mean, I can do a colonoscopy.
Wow.
Easily on most people who prefer to be awake, especially men who've never had surgery. Women, colonoscopy can be just a little bit more difficult, not because of pain tolerance or anything like that. It's just because the anatomy is a little bit different. So with women having wider pelvises, the colon can move around a little bit more, and that in of itself can just make it a little bit more uncomfortable to have. But for most men, doing a colonoscopy without sedation with a skilled gastroenterologist, so the key word, you have to have somebody who actually knows how to keep people comfortable without sedation. But if you have someone who does have that skill set, it's really not a big deal in the grand scheme of things. And the bowel preparation, hands down, is probably more difficult. So CT colonography, special CT scan, it can identify decent sized polyps and also cancer, but you still have to have the bowel preparation. So for most people, they actually prefer to have the colonoscopy if you still have to drink all that stuff. Because even with a CT colonography, if there's a polyp or something, you still have to end up having a colonoscopy so we can go in there and remove it. There's the barium enema, which is a X-ray where we give an enema that's basically barium, which is a solution that can light up on an X-ray. Okay, so we inject the barium into the rectum, and the radiologist can move the patient around on a table and help the barium kind of move through the colon. And then for the most part, you can see, maybe about half the colon. So you don't see all of it, but you definitely get a decent look at the left side, and you can identify large polyps or cancers via that. So that does not require as extensive as a bowel preparation as a colonoscopy or a CT colonography does. However, you still have to clean yourself out somewhat. And again, the right half of the colon really isn't evaluated all that well. So next you have your stool-based testing. So the stool-based testing, you have your FIT test. You also have Cologuard testing, and these are kind of immunochemical tests that are a little bit more advanced than just identifying whether or not there's blood in the stool. So that's the Hemocold test. But the other tests are a little bit more sophisticated. And the Cologuard is probably the best out of all of them. And the Cologuard can identify cancers, I would say about 95% of the time, and maybe large polyps like 90% of the time. So it's pretty decent as an initial screening test. But again, if it comes back positive, you still have to end up having a colonoscopy. So for right now, I mean, most people are still recommending colonoscopies. But I want everyone to be aware of what the alternatives are and what the options are, because there are some folks for a lot of different reasons, they may not necessarily want to have a colonoscopy. So people have jobs where, you know, you may not have the opportunity to get sedated, or you can't afford to get sedated because you don't necessarily can't get the time off. I mean, if I recall correctly, Barack Obama, when he was in office, he couldn't get a colonoscopy because they didn't want to sedate the president. So I have a lot of people that may not necessarily be the president, so to speak, but they also have jobs where sedation may be an issue. And this is actually one of the reasons why I provide unsedated colonoscopies, because there's a lot of people of color actually needing a ride to take you home after colonoscopy, or not being able to drive yourself home in of itself is a barrier to colonoscopy. So, you know, a lot of people may have transportation issues and stuff like that. So to mitigate that, especially for me as a Black gastroenterologist on the south side of Chicago, a lot of my patients are African American, and they're seeking like the Black gastroenterologist. So I probably have a higher burden of people who have transportation issues to some degree. So one of the ways to ensure that people actually get the care they need is either doing colonoscopy unsedated, yet keeping people comfortable. I don't want people to think that, you know, we're just doing colonoscopy unsedated and people are completely uncomfortable. Like, we're talking about comfortable and, you know, having a whole conversation just like what we're having, except we're doing a colonoscopy at the same time. So I have that skill set, and I also do a lot of stool-based testing for people who are hesitant to have colonoscopy, because those are reasonable options.
No, that's huge. That's huge. So, you know, there's going to be a large number of people who are scared, who are frightened, because they're going to think, well, if the recommendations are age 45 and Chadwick Boseman was diagnosed back in 2016 and he was in his 30s when he was diagnosed, does that mean what percentage of people are at risk at a very young age that's there? And what are the risk factors for developing colon cancer anyway?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple different studies that are starting to highlight the number of people under the age of 50 who get diagnosed with cancer. And I believe, depending on who you quote, anywhere between 12 to 20% of newly diagnosed colon cancers are going to happen to people under the age of 50. It's still a condition that, for the most part, happens to people 50 and up. However, it is not uncommon for people in their 30s or their 40s to get colon cancer. I don't know the exact circumstances for Chadwick Boseman and his diagnosis, okay? But oftentimes people at that age group, people under the age of 50, they may have a family history. So you may have a parent or a sibling who, you know, either had colon cancer or had advanced polyps, and like no one talked about it, or no one knew that as a first degree family member, everyone needs to get screened a little bit earlier than that family member, however old they were when they were diagnosed with their colon cancer or large polyp. So whether or not that existed in his family, I don't know. But also, there are people who have symptoms. So what frustrates me, you know, especially in terms of you know, thinking about health disparities and how sometimes we as people of color can be treated by the healthcare system, I see so many horror stories in which people had symptoms such as blood in their stool. And, you know, they may have had blood in the stool for years. And this is like, you know, brothers in their 30s, even sisters in their 30s. And instead of offering a colonoscopy, they just get treated over and over and again for hemorrhoids. And, you know, treating somebody once for hemorrhoids, not unreasonable, but treating somebody for years for hemorrhoids, for whatever reason, some practitioners are putting on, you know, these blinders and not thinking about other options and other possibilities. So what typically ends up happening, someone who's having rectal bleeding, they get frustrated and they say, well, you know what, I need to go see another doctor. Let me go find the Black gastroenterologist, which, you know, it's, for lack of numbers, it's me, especially if you're looking for someone at an academic institution in Chicago. So they'll come in and they say, hey, I've had, you know, blood in my stool for the past 3 years. And then I started losing weight. Now, you know, I'm normally, you know, 180, and now I'm like 140, and I'm not really working out as much as I used to. Like, I already know when I do a colonoscopy, it might be a problem. So I've encountered those situations where I've diagnosed colon cancer just like that. I mean, that is not just one, you know, patient experience. That is a generic script that I've encountered. and it frustrates me because I take no joy in telling someone that they have colon cancer.
Yeah.
Like I became a gastroenterologist for the sake of preventing colon cancer, not really because I wanted to diagnose it. I definitely enjoy diagnosing it early. So, if people can get treatment, it's still a treatable cancer as opposed to something that's not treatable. In women, what I've seen in women, and this is even more frustrating, I've seen a lot of Black women have anemia, where they come in, their blood counts are extremely low. I mean, anywhere between, 7 and 8, and which is super low. So just to give the listeners a frame of reference, when the blood counts or the hemoglobin gets to the point where it's less than 7, that's when we start talking about doing blood transfusions. And for your average woman, the hemoglobin should be around like 11 or 12 or so. So walking around with a hemoglobin of 7 is pretty low. But what I've seen people just assume that the anemia is due to fibroids, and they must just be losing blood from their uterus because of fibroids, because Black women have high rates of fibroids. So
Yes.
I have seen women in their 30s. I kid you not. I've seen women in their 30s get hysterectomies for anemia under assumption that it was fibroids, and they never even reported having heavy menstrual periods. But somehow these myopic blinders get put on, and a woman who is in her childbearing age ends up with a hysterectomy. And like when I hear that, especially thinking about the history of hysterectomy in this country, it's upsetting. I mean, like literally, I'm holding back the tears in the clinic room. And then
Are there any other symptoms that really kind of happen? So you
Yeah.
mentioned as far as like the bleeding that happens in the stools, which a lot of times people don't even look at their stools when they wipe.
So it's good to look at your stool for one thing. Like you won't notice blood if you don't look. And even if you're colorblind, I mean, it's going to be weird to ask somebody. But if you know you're colorblind, and they've done studies on this, like colorblind people may not necessarily be able to see their blood in the stool. So it's good for colorblind people to be aware that this is one limitation that could pose a health problem for you. But in terms of symptoms, okay, so blood in your stool is just one symptom that could suggest colon cancer, amongst other things. Okay, so I don't want people to think that every time you see blood in your stool, it's automatically colon cancer. No, it doesn't work that way. More than likely, it's probably hemorrhoids. More than likely, it's probably anal fissure or diverticular disease. However, colon cancer is a possibility. And if the blood in the stool is happening frequently and recurrently, that is a possibility that should be excluded. And that is the purpose of doing a colonoscopy in that context. Other symptoms could be changing your bowel habits. Okay, so if you are normally, having bowel movements every single day, and then you notice over the past couple of months, you're barely going, and the bowel movement looks a little bit different. It's thinner, it's pencil thin, so to speak. That may be a reasonable time to have a conversation. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's colon cancer. More than likely, you just have run-of-the-mill constipation, which is super duper common. But nonetheless, a change in bowel habits, can be a sign that you should bring up, or something that you should bring up to your physician. Other symptoms include just abdominal pain, weight loss, and not really being able to eat. But I think the blood in the stool is really probably the most common symptom that brings somebody to the hospital, or at least to the clinic. Constipation, a lot of people don't really get too excited about constipation. People focus on drinking more water, changing their diet, eating some more fiber. But for the average person, seeing a bunch of blood in the stool, that's going to put, whether or not you should have a conversation with your doctor on your radar.
All right, I want to jump in a couple of things you said that I really wanted to piggyback on. The first one, and we probably don't have time for this today, but I definitely want to speak to the bias in medicine. There are studies from everything from pain medicine to treatment for cardiac conditions. And to your point now, even significant, in this case, findings or complaints from a patient around, in this case, blood in the stool. And some of what you're saying is not a surprise, but still sad to hear that this stuff still happens in America, and why we have to encourage many more of our young people to go into medicine, nursing, and all the other healthcare professionals. So that's one thing I just wanted to throw in there. And of course, there is some genetic predisposition component here. And the other thing I read this week, I think that this came into the public eye. There is some trending towards a lower age of people overall having colon cancer. I forget where I read it, but there is some trend that people at younger and younger age, which is probably why the One Academy wants to start doing the colonoscopies at 45.
Yeah, so the trend is there, and in general, colon cancer above the age of 50 is actually decreasing. So I think we are doing better job for people over the age of 50. Not a perfect job, but better than what we have been. But for the younger generation, I mean, like people born in the 70s and up, I think this is the generation in which we're starting to see the impact of living this fast food standard American diet is starting to have. And yes, I feel like for folks born specifically 1970 on up, I mean, we're really the first generation Americans who, had fast food available for our entire lives, who had, a lot of the cheap, easy snacks available from, childhood on up to the present. Whereas, my parents and my grandparents' generation, food was very different. Like fast food wasn't a thing for our grandparents. Like conceptually, it did not exist. And for my parents, I mean, like fast food also was really not an intimate part of their childhood. But for me, I mean, from the get go, like I knew what a Happy Meal was.
Well, let's talk about food. We should talk about food a little bit. What kind of a diet? So we always talk about the standard American diet. Let's just be honest. I mean, we know that in the highest rates of colon cancer in the world are in the state I'm in right now, and that's Connecticut. And the lowest in the world, or some of the lowest in the world, is in Uganda, in the capital city of Uganda. The name of the city slipping my mind, but so there are two huge differences. So this speaks to slave food. It speaks to what is the difference if a black, and this is all Connecticut, so white or black, but what is the difference as a black person eating in Connecticut to a black person eating in Uganda? How does food impact the potential development of this disease?
Yes. So that is a good question. And there's multiple ways to even answer that question. I mean, I think to put it simply, the biggest difference between the diet of a black person or white person in Connecticut to the diet of someone in rural Uganda, or even better, rural South Africa, because there's a good study that actually looked at the diet of folks in rural South Africa. The biggest difference is really fiber. So the standard American diet is a diet that is fiber poor. So it's not a lot of fiber in the standard American diet. Whereas the rural South African diet, or even in Uganda, these are going to be predominantly plant-based diets with massive amounts more fiber than what we have in America. So in America, the average American, I mean, you're lucky to get 10 to 14 grams of fiber per day. Whereas your average rural South African or Ugandan, they're doing about 50 grams per day. So this is a night and day difference in terms of the amount of fruits and vegetables that people are taking in. We also not have to only look at the actual food items within the diet. We also have to look at the chemical exposures that are also within our diet, and also how we're preparing the food that we're actually consuming. So in the United States, I mean, we have a heavily animal-based diet. And we're preparing the foods. I mean, people aren't boiling meat and stuff like that for the most part. That's not what people are eating. Like, we're eating, meats that are cooked with high heat cooking techniques. Okay, so we're doing things that are deep fried, things that are roasted at high temperatures to get a nice little crust and char on there. I mean, I went to culinary school. I know how to do all this stuff, and a lot of barbecuing and a lot of grilling. So those grill marks or those burnt areas on the animal meat that people intentionally do to add flavor, they don't just add flavor, they also add carcinogens. Okay, so carcinogens, these are cancer promoting or cancer causing chemicals. Okay, so within those char marks, you have two specific chemicals. Polyaromatic hydrocarbons would be one of them. You also have nitrosamines. So both of those can combine to increase the risk of developing colon cancer. Now, another thing that we do with meat doesn't even involve us cooking it. It's how the meat is preserved. So in the United States, we eat a lot of processed meats. Okay, so we're talking about your bacon that's soaked in nitrites. We're talking about sausages. We're talking about deli meats. I mean, even deli meats now have been passed off as something healthy. But if you look at the WHO, they recommend, I mean, they label deli meats and stuff like that as a carcinogen. But if you turn on the TV, people are like,
class one carcinogen.
Class one carcinogen. But
Yes.
if you turn on the TV, you have certain companies saying like, this is how you eat healthy. Eat our sandwich and you're gonna lose weight. But the sandwich is actually rich with carcinogens. So those meats can also increase the risk of cancer, not only colon cancer, but just probably cancer in general, but definitely cancer because they come in intimate contact with the lining of the intestine, specifically the large intestine. Other issue, and this is all within the context of a low fiber, low plant-based diet.
Well, so what's interesting is that I stumbled across an article, and it was really kind of pertaining to when they standardized some of the more modern African diets that may have a little bit more processed foods in front of it. They still found that the meat consumption was lower.
Yeah.
And they equated the lower index of colon cancer that tied it right back into the meat consumption, because even when you take out and the fiber is lower, the meat consumption was lower, and that likely explained the lower incidence of cancer, colon cancer, even right now in the current era we're living in.
Yeah. So the meat, specifically red meat,
Yes.
meat has it contains heme. Okay, heme iron.
Yes.
Heme iron potentially can be toxic to the cells that line the colon, and that can induce damage in the DNA of the cells that line the colon, specifically called mutations. And these mutations over time, if we accumulate more and more and more of them, that's how polyps and eventually cancer starts to form. So I tell a lot of people, definitely be careful. If you're trying to decrease the risk of developing colon cancer, you have to really think about decreasing or eliminating your consumption of lamb, beef, pork, and even duck breast. Duck breast is actually considered a red meat. So yeah, I don't know if you ever cooked some duck breast, but it is red.
One thing I just read about was, in fact, in some studies, even chicken and turkey and fish are associated with high risk of colon cancer. And that probably is because it displaces some fiber, just by default. You displace some plant-based things with it. And you hit something on the head, something that's very important people to understand. The blood, the heme in the meat is pro-oxidizing.
Yeah.
It actually causes a hydroxyl. So it actually releases not just against the colon wall, and you can speak to this better than I can. The colon wall is massive. If you took it out and stretched it out, there's more to stretch out there than in the skin or in the lungs. It's a huge interface with the outside world. And much of our immune system is actually housed in the digestive tract. So, when you put these things in, it's not like it has to go through some secondary process to get to damage the organ. It literally has more time. And you spoke to constipation, and I work, my primary job is in urgent care as a physician. So I see a truckload of people who come in and they're constipated. One of the things I've learned is that a lot of people are constipated and regular at the same time. In other words, the transit time of their stool is 5 days, 6 days, 7 days. It's not 24 hours to 48 hours. It's much longer. Just that transit time being delayed causes some increased risk of digestive problems, and especially if you're eating foods that are carrying carcinogens through you and it's sitting in you a long time, and this is the largest surface area of your body comes in contact with the outside world, you can start to begin to see why the risk goes up. And something you said I've never thought about, this generation is literally the first generation to have had access to fast food and junk food for their entire lives.
That's deep.
Yeah,
that's deep. I've never thought of that before.
Yeah.
There's a lot of firsts in this generation that we don't really talk about, but we should. I mean, for the generation born in the early 70s, you're really the first generation after the civil rights movement to some degree. So for a lot of people, especially people who left the inner cities and moved to the suburbs, for people of that generation, you're literally like the first generation of Black folks to, live around white people. Like literally the first generation. And like
Yeah.
some of us in this room could fall under that category. And, and that I mean there's a lot of firsts that definitely can impact our overall health that I feel like they just don't get the attention they deserve.
And not to have an internal medicine subspecialty warfare between gastroenterologists and cardiologists, but one of the key things we know too as well is that this heme iron also impacts the heart, and we know it increases the propensity towards coronary artery disease. But on the side note, we're dealing in this world of COVID, not to dovetail into anything there, but Eric, something you just mentioned, and Edwin, you mentioned it too as well, as far as the transit time and the exposure from the surface area, that it reminded me and struck me immediately in terms of like with COVID. It's not just about the transient exposure to the coronavirus, but it's about the persistence and the amount, and that you're there, and so now there's that viral load.
Yep.
And so it's very similar. Whether or not we're speaking to coronary artery disease, we're speaking to colon cancer, the repetitive, unrelented exposure to an insult is what subjects you to a greater likelihood of developing the disease. And that's where the problems really lie.
Yeah, and I wholeheartedly agree with you. And even, if you want to talk about cardiology, we know that the gut microbiome can play a role in developing atherosclerotic disease, and specifically people who have a diet that's rich in red meat. So the bacteria, the way it can digest and process red meat, it can create the substance called TMAO that essentially can help increase the risk of developing atherosclerotic disease. But it's the bacteria in the gut that actually play a role in developing that toxic TMAO. So I tell people, I don't like to get into debates about, whose organ is the most important for the body and everything. Because I've seen my colleagues get in these debates. Like I tell people, I want to keep this heart that I have. Like I don't want to see how my body does without a heart, because I know it's important. Or a brain, or
or a lung,
I think they all serve a purpose.
I want to jump in on you said about TMAO. I've been reading up on that a little bit lately because of the pro-inflammatory effects of it. And you're right. We look at a lot from that, but again, it comes from the it's from one of the proteins, carnitine from meat. Yeah. So again, meat, and what I want to emphasize this. I mean, everyone knows we promote a whole food, plant-based style of living here. What we know is that the meat there's multiple reasons high meat diets do this. In India, for example, only 7% of the population eats meat on every day. India's cancer rates are a fraction of the United States, literally like a fraction, depending on the cancer, it's like a 10th on average across the board. There's a couple of reasons why. One of them is massively reduced amounts of meat and drastically increased amounts of fruits and vegetables. But one of the things that they do, and I want to kind of jump into some of the things that people can begin to do to proactively, not just what do you stop doing, but what do you start doing? One of them is curcumin and from turmeric is a powerful anti-cancer properties. And some people argue that this may be part of the reason why people in India have lower cancer rates. But a lot of it, curcumin is not absorbed, but that means it sits then against the colon wall and can have its anti-cancer effects. Is there anything else like that? Are there other substances that people need to be looking at eating? Obviously, fiber is attached to a lot of very.
So I agree. So there are so many nutrients in foods that have cancer fighting properties. I would say, instead of, I don't like to single out individual ones specifically. And I really try to tell people, if they eat a variety of fruits and vegetables and a variety of, herbs and spices and seasoning, the goal is to really expose yourself to admit as many foods and nutrients that potentially can have an anti-cancer effect. And I think if you're really doing that with a diverse and varied plant-based diet, you should be covering all your bases without having to, do a whole bunch of research and become a scholar in nutrition and everything, and a scholar on herbs and herbology and stuff like that. Like, you just eat a variety of fruits and vegetables, and you should be okay. But to your point, cumin and curcumin, which is one of the active ingredients within cumin, and same with turmeric for that matter. Um, these are foods that are known to have natural anti-inflammatory properties.
And
And we do know that with colon cancer, part of the mechanism for colon cancer could include some inflammation. So some of the inflammation that we get from eating some of the foods that can have a negative impact on our gut microbiome, which is the combination or composition of bacteria that we have in our intestine. Like the bacteria, they interact with our immune system. So there's a constant crosstalk between that bacteria and our immune system. And within that crosstalk, depending on what's going on, inflammation can be generated. And if that inflammation can be chronic, the inflammation of itself can put the cells that line the colon at risk for DNA damage, which subsequently can be passed on from cell to cell and so on and so forth to you start developing polyps and cancer. So I definitely believe a diet that's rich in antioxidants and also anti-inflammatories, not a diet rich in like ibuprofen and NSAIDs and stuff like that, naturally occurring substances with anti-inflammatory properties definitely should be helpful with decreasing or at least doing the best you can to decrease your risk for colon cancer. I mean, there's still things that maybe beyond our control, but if you want to put your body in the best position to not have colon cancer, diet is definitely one of those strategies. And I think really emphasizing the plants and de-emphasizing a lot of the red meats and even some of the non-red meats, to your point, it would probably be the best way to go about doing it.
absolutely. One of the things, and to the point really about curcumin, is that we're finding a lot more in research, period. So it's great work that's being done by Dr. William Lee, LI, that is, with the Anti-Angiogenic Society Institute. And what they found is a lot of these substances that are contained inside of your fiber-rich foods, your fruits and vegetables and whole grains, actually have something called anti-angiogenic properties. And what that means is that in order for cancer to grow, it has to have vessels. And so they're finding that things like blackberries and raspberries and kale and mushrooms, all these things have tremendous power. And so oftentimes we cut off the most important parts of these fruits and vegetables. We cut off the tops of our beets. We cut off the tops of our carrots, but finding out that those have some of the most nutrient dense components that can really truly impact your outcomes and your health. And so there's so much power in our food. And it reminds me, Edwin, you and I, we were kind of chatting a bit about it, and you alluded to it. And I don't know if you want to touch and go into it before Jeanette hits us with some of the questions and so forth.
Well, I just wanted to, also before we started with the questions, I did definitely want to go back to make sure that we cover the 6 reasons why colon cancer doesn't exist in Wakanda.
No, I appreciate that. Let me touch on something real quick here. I think it's so important really about that study out of Pittsburgh that looked at South Africans and look at diet swapping is so powerful inside that. Edwin, do you want to go ahead and comment on that?
Yeah, so that's a good study done by a researcher named Stephen O'Keefe. And I believe the study came out in around 2015 or so. And what they did was, ultimately in rural South Africa, the rates of colon cancer are much lower than what they are for African Americans in the United States. Okay, so in the United States, I would say on average, maybe like 65 out of 100,000 people of African descent in the United States are going to be at risk for developing colon cancer. Whereas in rural South Africa, that number is less than 5 out of 100,000. I mean, it's like markedly different. So the question is, why is it that our genetic brothers and sisters across the Atlantic Ocean are doing so much better when it comes to colon cancer than we are in the United States? What is the difference? So Stephen O'Keefe, he attempted to answer that question, but also proposed the hypothesis that a difference in diet was one of the contributing factors. Okay, so they looked at the diet of people in rural South Africa and found that they were on this rural South African diet that was rich in fiber. And they looked at your average African American within the study and found that they were pretty much on the standard American diet. Okay, so a diet that was rich with meat, processed foods, specifically ultra processed foods, high in sugar, a lot of processed drinks and sugary beverages and stuff like that. So what the researchers want to do, they want to look at both of these diets in both groups to see if there were any changes in the in metabolic markers for associated with an increased risk of developing colon cancer, and also changes within the bacteria itself. And what they found was they took the real South Africans and they put them on the standard American diet. Okay. And they did biopsies of their colon, and they were looking for things in terms of how rapidly the cells lining the colon were turning over. Okay. So one marker that may suggest an increased risk of colon cancer is if our cells are constantly turning over super duper rapidly, that gives the cells opportunities for something wrong to happen with their DNA. So every time our cells kind of turn over and replicate themselves, we have to replicate our DNA. And each time there's an opportunity for a mistake to happen. And that mistake, depending on where it occurs within the DNA, can set those cells up to become cancerous, potentially, or even precancerous. So they looked at how rapidly the cells for the South Africans were turning over on both diets, the standard American diet and the real South African diet. On the real South African diet, wasn't a whole lot of cell turnover. The cells were kind of hanging out, chilling, doing fine. And the combination of bacteria they had in their gut, also very diverse, very healthy combination of bacteria. But when they put the South Africans on the standard American diet, when they, I mean, literally feeding people hamburgers and French fries and, you know, Polish sausages and chicken wings and stuff like that, and, you know, Coca-Cola and a whole bunch of snacks, they found that the cell turnover started to increase exponentially. And the microbiome, the gut bacteria, actually became less diverse and subsequently less healthy. So immediately they saw that, man, it's not just that the Africans have some sort of genetic protection against colon cancer. Potentially the diet is one of the main culprits. But what about the African Americans? Okay, is it, you know, is there no hope for us? Like the study, you know, really sought to see, well, maybe if we took African Americans who spent, you know, generations on this standard American diet and we put them on a real South African diet, and let's see what happens to their colon, and let's see what happens to the bacteria in their gut. And what they found, which brings me joy, and, you know, also emphasizes my emphasis on eating a plant-based diet. When they looked at the African Americans, they found that on this real South African diet, rich in fiber, after for about 2 weeks, our cell turnover started to slow down. Meaning that our risk for colon cancer potentially was mitigated by this diet. Our bacteria that was once not as diverse became more diverse, and it became to thrive, and it became, you know, a little bit healthier. So I think with that study, it really just shows clearly how the foods that we eat can impact how our cells function. I mean, we think about food. Most people think about food as like, okay, you know, I'm going to gain weight if I eat this. And it's just like the way food interacts with the human body is way deeper than weight gain. And it's way deeper than how we just look in the mirror. This stuff literally can affect us at the level, not only at the level of the cells, but also at the level of the DNA itself, which for me is both humbling and fascinating.
Yeah.
And it's really one of the reasons why we need to have conversations like this, but we also need to figure out how to push research to actually look at what food is doing. We spend so many dollars, you know, researching pharmaceuticals and whatnot, and we don't spend enough, you know, looking at what people are doing every day, which is eating food.
So, Dr. McDonald, can you speak to the article that you did in 2018 about the 6 reasons why colon cancer doesn't exist in Wakanda?
I can. So that article, I wrote it right when the movie came out. I had no idea that Chadwick actually had colon cancer. I mean, when I think about it, it is, I'm almost glad he never saw it, because I think when I wrote it, I tweeted it out and I put his name on there. I hope the brother never saw it. But I tweeted it to him, and, you know, the whole time he had colon cancer. And I mean, who knew? And it's one of the reasons why this is particularly shocking for me, because I use this movie as a tool to explain lifestyle changes that can decrease your risk for colon cancer, and also to talk about screening. So in that article, I listed 6 reasons why colon cancer doesn't exist in Wakanda, the mythical place of Wakanda. One reason was that Wakanda is in Africa. Okay, so the race of colon cancer in Africa in general are lower than that of the United States. So just by that fact alone, colon cancer is going to be a little bit less likely in Wakanda. Okay. Wakandans embrace technology. I mean, throughout the movie, you looked at the mythical city of Wakanda and you saw how much technology they had. I mean, they had flying cars, they had, healthcare tools way beyond what we have right now. So I figured whatever technology they have to decrease the risk of developing colon cancer, it would be technology that they embrace. Whereas the United States, we do have technology that can decrease our risk for developing colon cancer. I'm a gastroenterologist. I use this technology all the time. But we still have a lot of hesitation to even embrace the technology that we already do have to decrease the risk. And a lot of hesitation can come from a lot of different reasons. I mean, you have a lot of people, there's homophobia that unfortunately still exists. And some people connect homophobia with getting a colonoscopy, primarily because the colonoscopy does involve entering the rectum. And then there's lack of access. And so, we have a healthcare system that doesn't give equal access to everybody. So a lot of people may not even have the access to the technology that we can use to decrease the risk of colon cancer. Whereas I think the Wakandans, it seemed like they would do a little bit better. Like I don't see King T'Challa saying you don't have insurance, good luck. But the Wakandans also knew their family history. So at the beginning of the movie, I don't know if you remember, it shows like, all the different Black Panthers going to King T'Challa. And, King T'Challa was also very close with his father. Like, I feel like if, the former king, if he had a colonoscopy and had a polyp or something, he probably would have let King T'Challa know. Like, I don't think it would have been a secret.
Right.
But here in the United States, especially amongst people of color, we have a habit of keeping certain things a secret. And certain health conditions are a secret. And when it comes to colon cancer, I mean, this is a secret that could have devastating consequences to your subsequent family and progeny. So that's why I tell a lot of my older patients, and I don't want to say older patients, a lot of my patients in their 60s or 70s who may be past due for colonoscopy. They should have got it at age 50 or 45, but they're 60, 70 years old and they're like, I don't want it. And I tell people getting a colonoscopy is bigger than just you. It applies to your family members. If we do this procedure and you end up having cancer or you end up having a large polyp, like your son, your daughter, your brother and your sister, they may have to get a colonoscopy earlier. So doing this is really not only demonstrating self-care, but it's also demonstrated care for your family. And I think with Wakanda, that appreciation of family seemed to be reflected in the movie. Now, Wakandans also have a healthy diet. So we spent a long time talking about the benefits of the plant-based diet, especially using it as a tool to decrease the risk of colon cancer. Well, in the movie Wakanda, I got the impression that a lot of Wakandans were vegetarians.
And
M'Baku,
even right?
M'Baku, he's like, M'Baku was a vegetarian. So just based upon that alone, I think that in combination with all the other reasons I mentioned, the risk of developing colon cancer in Wakanda should be relatively low. And then plus, they seem to exercise a lot. So we know that physical activity and maintaining a healthy body weight can also potentially decrease the risk of developing colon cancer. And with the Wakandans, I mean, did you see the Dora Milaje? So those are the guards that were protecting it. Look, I wouldn't pick a fight with anybody in Wakanda, and I'm from Chicago.
No, I didn't see him. I'm married. I'm married. I didn't see him. I wasn't looking at him at all during the whole movie.
Right. So I mean, yeah. So I see, now I'm in trouble. Like now, my wife is gonna be. When I come, like I just need to stop now.
No, you're good. But then you also mentioned that they didn't smoke cigarettes, correct? And
yes. So I mean, I didn't
link of cigarette smoke and colon cancer, like cigarette smoking and colon cancer. What is that?
So, I mean, cigarettes are just bad for everything.
Okay.
I feel like if there's any listeners out there who are trying to figure out like just one step towards becoming healthier, If you don't know where to start, I feel like starting with not smoking is always a good step, a good first step. We know that cigarettes they have multiple different carcinogens. They impact the body in a myriad of ways, a multitude of ways. Obviously, with heart disease, they are a huge risk factor, and same with stroke. But they're also a risk factor for colon cancer. And in the movie Black Panther, I mean, I didn't see anybody flying a spaceship smoking a cigarette. I didn't see it, and there was no one, standing on the corner on the streets of Wakanda smoking cigarettes. However, I can drive up and down the block here in Chicago and see that. See plenty of people standing on the corner smoking cigarettes. And these are risk factors for not only colon cancer but other cancers. And within our community, we also smoke a lot of mentholated cigarettes. So those menthol cigarettes, I believe, based upon a study, 95% of menthol smokers are African Americans. And the crazy thing about menthol, and this is really crazy. I want you guys to look this up. And this is really not. It's in the medical literature, but it really hasn't got the attention that it deserves. So African Americans, we harbor a polymorphism in our genes, a variation in our genes that potentially can make menthol cigarettes more addictive. And this is something that's like researched. So here we're smoking these mentholated cigarettes that genetically we may be more addicted to us. But the biggest problem with mentholated cigarettes is that they're easier to smoke. So you don't get the harshness from your regular cigarettes. The menthol makes them smoother. You don't cough as much, and they're easier for people to get hooked on them. But you can also smoke more of them and smoke them for a longer period of time, which in general can also increase the carcinogenicity because you're doing more of it. It's easier to tolerate. It's just like let's make something that causes cancer even easier to do.
Well, to that point, here's the thing that's really just devastating. You talked about the level of exposure from those born in the 70s on forward, but our kids right now are being faced with this essentially brewing pandemic of vaping, where these vaping is being flavored, is being crafted in the form of like candy. And so I'm thankful that there was a bill that was recently passed to increase the tax on it to somewhat dissuade it, but they're exposing themselves at even a younger age to these carcinogens. And that as parents, we have to be very much so aware of even the appearance. They make it so it can be hidden in the backpacks. It can be hidden in the sweatshirts. It can be hidden inside of a USB looking port that's there. And so all around us, we're being bombarded by, to use the words of someone from a prior show, the business of business is business, that they don't care about health. They don't care about our health, and that they're constantly bombarding us with all of these things that are to our detriment.
Yeah, and it's so true. And even with what you said with vaping, so the Trump administration, they did change some of the legislation. So you can't get e-flavored cigarettes as easily as you could, specifically for kids. With the exception, the only flavor they left out was the menthol.
Oh.
Right.
What
a coincidence.
Like I can't make this up. And when I talk about it, I don't want to sound like, the woke hotep, guy in the room that's always talking about the conspiracy theories. But this is what really happened. I mean, you have real studies indicating that we may have a genetic predisposition to mentholated cigarettes. We know that they're highly addictive because they're easier to smoke. And when all the little kids and everybody started smoking them, you're like, whoa, these e-cigarettes, these flavors are bad. We're going to eliminate all the flavors except the flavor that most African Americans smoke.
Well, let me try to run down really quick some of the questions that we've gotten. And there was a lot of discussion in the chat window. There was a question about how important is it to clean out our colons, and should this be done? And that was a question. One of the questions.
That is a good question. And, I know a lot of people are trying to do these colon cleanses and stuff like that. And
from the bottom is what they're doing nowadays. So it's not like old school days when they would drink something. They're actually having people put things in their behind that are not as well trained as you are. So speak to that, because that's a little scary for me sometimes.
Yeah, so I mean, it is scary. There's definitely risk of having complications from that, and those complications can include actual mechanical damage to the colon from
Mm.
inserting whatever the device they're using to fill up the colon. But also, I don't know how clean the tools or equipment they are using. So there's the risk of passing on other
Cross
bloodborne diseases,
contamination.
cross
Right.
contamination, passing on
Hmm.
diseases. I mean, those risks are real because that is not a industry that's kind of monitored by
Regulated.
it's not regulated by the FDA.
Mm-hmm.
So for our
Hmm.
colonoscopies, I mean, we have to clean our colonoscopies in this huge standardized fashion. I mean, it is a big
Yes.
ordeal for a colonoscopy to get cleaned and then get reused over and over again. And if you are a university and people are getting conditions, diseases and whatnot from like coming in for colon cancer, that's bad news. I mean, that is like nobody wants that to happen, and that is a big
Hmm.
problem. So we have so many processes to prevent that from happening. Now, my other concern with the colon cleanses is that they haven't really been studied in detail. Okay, and I don't know exactly what they're doing in terms of the long term effects, specifically on the gut microbiome. Okay,
Okay.
Mm,
so we are washing out a lot of the bacteria that
That you
exists in
need.
our colon that you
Hmm.
need. This is
Hmm.
bacteria that serves a purpose. So just kind of rinsing it all away, I don't know if that is a healthy thing or not. So studies show that when you do one of those cleanses, the bacteria changes for about a month or so, and then goes back to normal.
Okay. And
But
that
even
includes like enemas, correct? That's also enemas.
well, a colon cleanse
It's a lot more
is a lot
aggressive.
more.
You know,
It's very much so more aggressive.
Okay.
So you probably wouldn't get the same effect with an enema. But with the colon cleanse, you definitely can have an impact on the microbiome, and
Okay.
it is not clear if that impact is healthy. And I think a lot of it also depends on why you're doing the cleanse in the first place. Okay,
Right.
so if
Right.
you're trying to cleanse out, unhealthy diet, you're going to have more benefit than actually eating healthy diet. So I
Right.
feel like eating, fruits and vegetables and whole
Fiber
grains and
rich.
seeds and
Right.
nuts, a fiber-rich diet, like
Hmm.
that's all the cleanse you need, especially if you're drinking water on top of it.
Right.
But if you're, just trying to do a quick fix, I realize if there's anything I learned in medicine, quick fixes they don't really
Yeah.
work.
Right.
And
no.
I mean, I almost want to. I'm not a big fan of
and
making rules in medicine, but I feel like that's probably a rule at this point.
It's not good.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay, so there were also a lot of questions about is the risk of the procedures involved in a colonoscopy greater than the benefit if you are plant-based and you are eating a plant-based diet?
Let's see. Can you hear me? Oh, yeah, you
Yes.
broke up for 1 second. So I would say definitely. I mean, to all the vegans, vegetarians, ovo lacto vegetarians, etc., pescatarians, wherever you fall in on this.
Anytarians?
Yeah, Mediterranean diet, flexitarian. I mean, wherever you fall in on this spectrum, I applaud you for thinking about how fruits and vegetables can make you healthier and how avoiding or decreasing your intake of meat can also make you healthier. However, when it comes to, do we know what's 100% protective against colon cancer? I don't know of anything that's 100% protective against
Yeah.
colon cancer. So I tell all, my vegan and vegetarian patients, friends, and or family members, even myself, that you still have to get your age-appropriate cancer screening. Not just for colon cancer, but for
Right.
breast cancer, cervical cancer, et cetera. Even though, studies show that the diet probably helps out with breast cancer and cancer in general, but like still do your due diligence. So the risk of the procedure, I mean, I've done thousands and thousands of colonoscopies. I've never seen any perforations and any significant complications. These are complications that we have to cite and bring up anytime we consent for anyone to do the procedure. But overall, it is a safe procedure, and I definitely see more people with colon cancer than I do with complications from the colonoscopy. Um, so the only population that we question whether or not the risk of the procedure outweigh the benefits are people over the age of 85. So an older population
Right.
that may have a whole list of other comorbidities, especially you've been on the standard
Mhm.
American diet for many years, you're 85 years old, you might not necessarily
You're doing pretty good, huh?
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we should probably just kind of leave you alone. Uh, so we
Okay.
do not recommend that people get colon cancer screening after the age of
Okay.
5. And even after the age of 75, it becomes optional. So between 75 and 85, it really just depends on how well you're doing. And it's really a personal conversation. But for everybody
You know,
else, go ahead.
oh, sorry about that. You know, what I was going to say is that when I'm doing procedures, what I tell patients a lot of times is that when they're concerned about the risk, as I rattle off all the risks that pertain with the procedure, I ask them if they drive a car or do they ride in a car? And
Yeah.
99.9% say yes, they do. I ask them if they ever looked at the fine print when they purchased that car that said, by driving this car, you can crush your chest, you can sever your arm, you can die, right? And they say, no. And I said, no, it's not written there. But all those things can happen, and they happen very frequently as you think you're in control, putting on your lipstick, reaching for your coffee, talking to your kids, looking for your cell phone, and you're at greater risk than you are during the procedure that we're proposing in this particular instance. And so the only difference is that you perceive that you're in control and you perceive you don't have control during the procedure, which makes you fearful. And so it's an issue of understanding the risk versus benefits. The benefits of identifying something early on
Yeah.
that you can make an impact and a change versus identifying it late, where now you're subjugated towards less than ideal treatment options at that point in time. And so that's where one has to really think hard and long about that sort of thing.
And
Let me jump in and just quickly say,
Mhm.
so there may be some people watching that have some concern with getting colonoscopies. I would agree with Dr. McDonald. Overall, it's an incredibly safe procedure. But he also gave you other options of how you can be screened at the beginning of this talk. So you really are adamant, you're whole food plant-based and have been for decades. Well, you should at least still get the annual occult blood test done, and or do them every 3 years, and then do every 5 years sigmoidoscopy maybe. But you should be doing something. Is my point, because there's a lot of people who are gonna say, well, I eat a plant-based diet, I don't need to do anything. He did give you some other options. And remember, if one of those are positive, you are going to, the colonoscopy would probably be your next step anyway. So at least you should get screened.
Right. So less invasive in the beginning and then work your way back if necessary. Now, we talked about the risk. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
And I was going to say with sigmoidoscopy, I mean, I know it still pops up in some of the guidelines and recommendations, but like honestly, like
I'm not a fan.
Yeah, like most gastroenterologists are not doing sigmoidoscopy.
Yeah,
like I mean,
general surgeons are the ones who seem to do it. I don't know.
Yeah, like if you're gonna have someone insert a camera inside of your rectum, you might as well just have.
Let's go all the way.
Right. We might as well, if we're gonna do it, we should just do it, and do the real procedure and get all the information you can. And to the listeners, a sigmoidoscopy is a smaller, shorter camera that only really looks at the left colon, but it does not look at the middle part of the colon or the right part of the colon. So cancer can happen throughout the entire colon. And right now, we're actually finding the cancers that are the easiest to miss are typically the cancers on the right side of the colon. So for me and my family members and friends, if anybody I know is asking me, like, Dr. McDonald, what would you recommend? Would you bring up a sigmoidoscopy? I wouldn't tell anybody to get a sigmoidoscopy. Like, I would say, if you're going to do the Cologuard and the stool test, that's one thing. But if you're going to have somebody take a look, just go ahead and do the procedure.
All right. So with regard to family history, and we talked about that they were moving the screening age from 50 to 45. If you have a family history, what age would you recommend, considering everything that you know now, for people to start getting screened, or at least to get the first screening?
It should be at age 40 or 10 years before whoever was diagnosed with colon cancer. Okay, whichever's earlier. Okay, so just to give you a frame of reference, if somebody was diagnosed, say, Chadwick Boseman, okay? So I don't know if he has kids or not, but it sounds like he was diagnosed at the age of 39, which means that his kids, his first-degree relatives, they should start getting their colonoscopies at 29.
Okay. And that goes back to Wakandans knowing their history.
That's why you got to know your family history. It's really important, and we have to talk about it. And I tell all my patients, not only my patients of color, but all of them, especially if I
Mhm.
identify a large polyp or a colon cancer. I tell people, I'm like, look, you have to tell your family members. It's not me, because of HIPAA. I just can't call up your brother and just be like, hey, your brother has colon cancer. Like it doesn't,
Right.
like the healthcare
Right.
system prevents us from doing that. So
Right.
it is our responsibility to make sure our family is informed. Um, and I drive that point home over and over again, not only for colon cancers, but also for the large polyps too. And I've
Okay.
seen family members come in, they're say I diagnosed a cancer on a family member that was 46, and I see their younger brother, who may be in their 30s or so, come in, and they have a large polyp that we take out that does not have cancer. But
Hmm.
because we found that large polyp before it actually became cancerous, their risk of actually developing cancer has been, almost eliminated, at least for the short
Right.
term.
Right.
And now we just have to put them on a nice surveillance protocol to make sure no polyps are coming back. But we also
Hmm.
have to make sure they look at their diet, because I not only want to rely on my procedures, like I don't want to just tell people you had a polyp, come back in 3 years and let me take out some more polyps. I want people to rely on me as a safety net, but primarily rely on actually changing their lifestyle, because that's going to be the things that's going to decrease the rate of these polyps even forming in the first place.
Right. Okay, so there was a question here about what about Helicobacter pylori?
Okay, H.
Okay,
pylori.
okay,
Yeah.
all right, go. I
Yeah,
don't
so
know.
H. pylori, this is good. So it's good to even have a conversation about like what cancer is and
Hmm.
what can cause cancer. So I know we talked about DNA damage, but there's a lot of different stuff out there that can damage DNA, that can increase these cells from turning normal to actually something that's precancerous or cancerous. And H.
Hmm.
pylori, it's not a food. It is not a toxin, so to speak. It's a naturally occurring bacteria, but is one of the most common causes of stomach cancer, gastric cancer in the world.
Okay.
And this bacteria lives in our stomach.
Hmm.
So that H. pylori doesn't really have anything to do with colon cancer, but it definitely can cause stomach cancer. And in terms of people at risk for stomach cancer, it's really the Asian populations that have the highest risk of stomach cancer from H. pylori.
Mm.
And I see it a lot. We have people who are coming from Chinatown, or people just living here all over the place, can be at risk from this H.
Mm.
pylori. So it's a bacteria that lives in the stomach. It can be hard to treat. So oftentimes we have to treat it with 2 or 3 antibiotics at the same time. And it's so hard to treat. Even after treating it with a couple antibiotics, we have to actually confirm that the bacteria is gone. So the way we diagnose it is a couple different ways. Some people use a breath test to diagnose it. Oftentimes we can do biopsies. We do an upper camera test, upper endoscopy, where I can look inside your esophagus and your stomach and take biopsies throughout the stomach and use those biopsies to detect H. pylori. Or we can do a stool test.
Hmm.
As far as the symptoms of H. pylori, symptoms would include just kind of abdominal pain, maybe some nausea. Oftentimes, this is a cause of what's known as gastritis, where there's a little bit of
Hmm.
inflammation in the stomach. And I feel like gastritis is such an overused term, because,
Right.
oftentimes, when I think about gastritis, I think about the redness that I see when I do a procedure and I do biopsies, and the pathologist says there's gastritis. But
Mm.
I do feel like we use this term all the time. So like someone goes to the ER and they have like upset stomach, and everyone's
Yeah,
like,
you
oh,
hear
it's
a lot.
gastritis.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
like no one's looked in their stomach. So it's oftentimes very confusing to me as a gastroenterologist, because people are like,
Mm.
yeah, I went here and they told me I had gastritis. And I'm like, did you have H. pylori gastritis? Did they take a look in your stomach? And they're like, no, they
Right.
just looked at me and said gastritis. And it's like, oh, okay. So you haven't officially got a diagnosis. You were told a diagnosis, but that does not mean you were diagnosed.
Okay.
If that makes any
So
sense.
it makes a lot of.
Absolutely.
So one of the things that people have been talking about is in terms of like some of the things that Chadwick Boseman may have had to deal with, like
Yeah.
those 6 or 7 years while he was, dealing with the colon cancer and, basically not necessarily, talking about it, but still going on to do these movies under, these horrible health conditions for himself and just, putting it out there. Can you speak to some of the symptoms that he would have had or some of the things that he might have been going through during that time period?
It is. it's hard to really say.
Okay.
So I notice. I mean, just looking at him
The weight
initially,
loss. Right.
the weight loss to me, it really became noticeable was that Spike Lee movie, what, the
The
Five
bloods,
Bloods.
the five
Yeah,
bloods. Right.
yeah. So when I saw him in the Five Bloods, it's just like, whoa, like
Yeah.
he really lost a lot of weight. I mean, dramatically.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
in the Five Bloods, I mean, that movie was filmed and finished not too long ago. So
Right.
I imagine majority of his health issues probably happened within the past, year or so, since that movie was filmed and completed. As far as what he was going through before, I mean, it's hard to really say, because looking at Black Panther, I mean, he had it when he had Black Panther, and you look at the
Right.
fight scenes, he looked like he was one of the fittest people in Hollywood. So I have no idea, but colon cancer in general can be painful,
Right.
depending on where it's located, how big it is, and whether or not it spread to other organs, and if it did spread to or other organs, what organs it is spread to. So each of those are factors that I think about when I think about what symptoms is somebody experiencing. But
Mm-hmm.
for me, I specialize in nutrition. So
Okay.
as a gastroenterologist, that means I see a lot of patients with cancer, and I see cancers that have caused obstructions where the bowel is obstructed, or the large colon's obstructed, and people can't really eat the old-fashioned way, primarily because intestines just aren't working because they're so damaged and obstructed by cancer. So for a lot of my patients, they're in extreme pain. I mean, and we have to put different tubes there to alleviate pressure so gas can come out, and I mean, it can be a very painful experience. So I would imagine that he was not comfortable through some of those
Right.
movies, and I imagine that he definitely knew there was something wrong. But to his strength, his tenacity, and his determination, he somehow fought through it and put together these works of art that we're all going to appreciate forever. I
Forever.
mean, he is probably someone. He's probably everybody's favorite actor when we didn't know that he was our favorite actor.
Absolutely.
Because his career was so early, you know what I mean? Like, we didn't even have
Yeah.
the time to really reflect. Like, oh, you know what? I think that's my favorite actor. Like,
Right. Right.
like we're still thinking about Denzel and stuff.
Denzel.
Yeah,
Yeah.
uh,
Absolutely.
yeah. But he was definitely on that path to
Mm-hmm.
being the person that would have taken over Denzel. Um, so when I think about what he must have been going through and what he accomplished, it's really humbling, and
Right.
it's something that puts things in perspective. And for me, I see a lot of people triumph over this stuff, and I see a lot of people. And when I say triumph, triumph can mean a lot of different things. It doesn't necessarily mean beating the disease. It doesn't
Right.
necessarily mean I'm cured from cancer. Like, triumph,
Mm-hmm.
for me, when I see people, when I see someone who understands their diagnosis
Mm-hmm.
and understands what they want to get out of their treatment plan,
Right.
what
And
they want
life, right?
in life.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a triumph. Or
Yeah.
I've seen people become advocates for colon cancer who've
Mm-hmm.
had, cancer that's not treatable.
Right.
But despite having cancer not treatable, they decided that they were going to use their time to ensure that other people, maybe one less person, ends up similar to them.
Right.
And they may not have survived, but in my mind, that is a triumph. Um,
Absolutely.
so when I think of Chadwick Boseman
Mm-hmm.
and really being a fighter and whatnot, although he did succumb from the cancer itself, but he
Mm-hmm.
didn't lose the battle. And
Absolutely.
he was definitely triumphant. And the fact that we're having this conversation right now is really a testament to how triumphant the brother was.
That's
Absolutely.
right. That's right.
Absolutely. And there are a lot of other questions that I'm not going to be able to get to because of time, but there was a question about what is a typical survival rate for colon cancer. And I'm sure that it depends on what stage it's caught at.
Yeah, it depends on what stage it's caught at. I mean, for him, he had stage 4 colon cancer. I mean, if I had to guess offhand, the 5-year survival for stage 4 colon cancer is probably 40-50% or so, if that. But colon cancer caught early is definitely survivable. So I've had colon cancers that I removed as a gastroenterologist. So, you're doing a procedure and you find a big polyp, and you're like, okay, well, is that a polyp or is that cancer in there? A lot of times you can tell clearly when it's cancer, but sometimes it's like, is this cancer or is it just a big polyp? Hard to really say. And I removed polyps where, you look at it under the microscope, there's actually cancer inside of the polyp. But the fact that I removed everything and, there's no cancer at the edges of where my resection was, like they've been treated.
Right.
Like I took out the cancer.
Right.
And for those people, we really just have to, I still send them to oncology to decide whether or not we should do any additional treatment. But oftentimes it's really just coming back for repeat colonoscopies to make sure you're not developing any new cancers or nothing's growing in an area in which I removed the previous cancer. And then there's people who have cancers where it just may be localized and you just need a surgery.
Right.
So surgery is something that, of course, it's not a walk in the park, so to speak. But having one part of your colon removed is definitely easier than having radiation and being on chemotherapy for months and stuff like that. So in many ways, if something that is surgically treatable, that's actually a good thing. Right. And for the most part, most of the surgeries involving colon cancer, the surgeon's not removing your whole colon. They're not removing all your intestines. It is just the portion where the cancer is located. And most people in that situation don't even have to end up with an ostomy bag. So I know a lot of times when people are concerned about getting treated for colon cancer, everyone's concerned about whether or not they're going to have this bag that's attached to their body, which it is for a lot of people just the idea of having a bag attached to your body where feces can be visible is very distressing. That's something that the average person needs to adjust to get used to, and I've seen a lot of people get used to it where they don't even think about it. But going through that process is not easy, just because your body is physically different than what it was before. But when it comes to colon cancer, most people don't even have to end up with an ostomy bag. You just go have your surgery and they reconnect you, and that's that. Now that depends on where the cancer is located. Right. For some of the rectal cancers that are very, very close to the rectum, it's hard for the surgeons to actually reconnect everything because it's right. There's nothing to connect to. But that is those are few and far between. So most commonly, people just go get their surgery, stay in the hospital for a day or two, and go about their business. And whether or not they need chemotherapy in addition to the surgery, that's really a conversation between the patient, the surgeon, and the oncology doctor.
Thank you.
I guess that means the questions are over.
Yeah.
Yes.
I appreciate the opportunity for coming on and talking about colon cancer and also showing our respects to Chadwick Boseman. So it really means a lot to me. And it also means a lot to my patients because, again, I see these stories. I've seen women get hysterectomies for, for fibroids. Meanwhile, they had colon cancer the whole time. And when they come to see me, and it's not even like a secret you had colon cancer. It's just like, wait a minute. You've never had heavy menstrual periods, but you're seeing blood in your stool, but they took your uterus out? That's what they said. And for a lot of people, we're still listening to physicians and, your average physician can make an argument that sounds pretty good. But when you really step back and really listen to them, like, wait, this doesn't even make sense. It just doesn't. But
so leave us with some hope. Leave us with your final thoughts.
So final thoughts. Colon cancer, if caught early, does not have to be deadly. Colon cancer can be prevented with the technology that we have using the stool test and doing our colonoscopies. Majority of cancers can be prevented. And looking at the research study that we just discussed, the diet can play a role in decreasing our cancer. So my hope, the fact that we're having this conversation is in of itself in step direction. That gives me hope. The fact that so many people love Chadwick Boseman and so many people are aware that he passed from colon cancer. I think if we can learn anything from this tragedy, it's learning that we really need to have these conversations and really focus on how common colon cancer is and the ways we can prevent it. And I think his tragic passing is going to be the impetus for that. It already is. So for the listeners out there, eat healthy, exercise. And I know that sounds generic for me as from a physician, but it's the truth. Like, you don't have to spend all your money on probiotics. You don't have to get all these crazy supplements if you're trying to decrease your risk of cancer. Get a whole bunch of fruits and vegetables, a whole bunch of variety of seeds, nuts, and grains, and learn to cook and eat healthy, and then also be active.
Great. Tell us where folks can find you. Where can they find you? I heard you have a book coming out. Tell us about the book that's out actually already.
Yeah, so that's a good point. So I wrote a book called Do You Know Where My Food Goes? And it's a children's book that's really an introduction to digestion. So it's very helpful. I mean, with what happened to Chadwick Boseman, I mean, this is affecting kids right now. Like, kids are upset. Black Panther was a hero. So I've had, family members or friends or people who just randomly bought the book said that they use the book to actually talk to their kids about what the colon is and why it's important. So now when you have this conversation about colon cancer, the kids have some sort of a context to even appreciate that conversation. So I wrote the book primarily because I saw so many adults who had no idea what the anatomy of the gastrointestinal tract was. These were adults, and these were educated adults. So we just, our educational system, we just don't learn this stuff anymore. Or maybe we just never really did. So I thought it'd be a good idea to write a book that would be interactive between kids and their parents or whatever adult is reading to them, so everyone can learn. So the book, it was geared for kids, but I also want adults to learn, especially if there's any opportunities for them to learn some of this stuff. And the kids book is basically, it is a book where you have his father, who's just a plain, regular appearing African American man talking about digestion to his kid. And the kid is basically asking him, Dad, do you know where my food goes? And the parent is basically just explaining everything in a way that kids can understand it. And another reason why I wrote the book, and this happened before, George Floyd and everything, I wanted to humanize Black men. So for me, as an African American man, I've been pulled over more times than I like to account. I have stared down the barrels of guns held by police officers on multiple occasions. One occasion, I still, every time I see on the news that there's another incident where a Black man was shot or something like that, like I still probably have PTSD from one event, because it could have been me.
Absolutely.
Could have been me. So for me, carrying those experiences with me, I thought it would be helpful for people to see Black men and Black boys in a non-threatening way, just talking about food and digestion. And if kids saw those images at an earlier age, maybe when those kids are, in their 20s and 30s as police officers, and they remember this book, like, maybe that'd be one of the things that humanizes us in the eyes of others, and even also in the eyes of ourselves, for that matter. So, those are all some of the reasons that inspired me to write the book. And I remember when I showed the book to like a nurse, and she was just like, the book is good, but that dad doesn't look like he knows anything about digestion.
Wow.
Yeah. And I mean, if you look at the book, the dad, if I put a baseball cap on, the dad looks just like me. I mean, he's just
Wow.
a brown-skinned Black man with a beard. His image is actually inspired by my favorite hip hop producer. So before I got into medicine, I definitely was really into hip hop, and I grew up DJing and all that stuff, and I was trying to make beats and everything. And there was a producer, Jay Dilla, he's like a producer's favorite producer. And he passed away at the age of 32, I believe, from complications related to lupus. So he died from kidney failure associated with kidney disease from lupus. And I use his image as kind of like an inspiration for the book. So that's kind of like my subtle homage to my favorite producer.
Yeah. No, that's deep, man. Listen, we are so appreciative of you joining us and sharing this wealth of knowledge. And I know for sure my kids are older, but I'm gonna still get your book. I haven't gotten your book, but I'm about to get that book on Amazon, which is where everyone can find it. It's been when did it drop? How long ago did it drop on Amazon?
It's been about a month now.
Oh, no, so it's all right, great. You gotta get me a signed autographed copy of that.
I got you.
I'll buy it. I'll buy it, but I definitely want one. Eric, close us out too as well. Give us the thoughts, recap, leave the listeners with some final thoughts and areas of hope.
I think the biggest area of hope here is that you're not destined. We're not all destined to some of these diseases. That in fact we can live differently to reduce our risk. Obviously, there are things we can do from a technological standpoint, as mentioned. But I like more talking about food than and how food can be used as medicine than probably anything. And we didn't really get into that tonight, but I think people need to really understand that your colon comes in contact with everything you eat, and if you want a healthy colon, eat healthy. So I definitely want to encourage people to eat foods rich in antioxidants, phytonutrients, and that is a whole food plant-based diet. And I think we got some really good information tonight. And it goes back to Africa. The whole slave food project always sends us back to Africa. And when we talked about Uganda and South Africa, it is mind-blowing that what we've expected to happen to us here in the States does not happen to our brothers and sisters across the pond. And so it tells us that there's hope, because we really just have to go back to being who we were, and we can reduce a lot of this risk.
No, that's great. That's incredible. What I'll add and chime in just as the last bit is that you never know what's brewing underneath the surface. You never know what's lurking in terms of disease. And that's what the life of Chadwick Boseman showed me. You don't know what disease level. And so the question really arises, are you feeding the good guys or feeding the bad guys? We spoke about this magnificent area that's undetected underneath in the colon called the microbiome, filled with bacteria that can help you or hurt you. And so the question is, what are you doing for your health? Focusing positively. What are you doing? Moving towards a goal, banding together as a community. And so we have to do that to empower ourselves of all colors, of all creeds. It becomes extremely important for us to live the best life we can, increasing our health span. So once again, Dr. McDonald, thank you so much for joining us on Slave Food.
Oh, thank you.
Awesome.
Thank
awesome.
you.
It's been wonderful.
Keep up the good work.
I appreciate
Yes,
you guys.
Yeah, keep up the good work.
And to the audience, we will see you all again soon. We will send you a notification. I believe our next talk will be on COVID and on the twindemic, and that's coming soon, next couple of weeks. And we'll send you more information. Please remember to follow us on Facebook at Slave Food, on YouTube at Slave Food Project. And always remember, slavefood.org is always available. You can sign up, learn more about how you can transform your nutrition to fend off colon cancer, fend off heart disease, and many other ailments that are out there. Look forward to seeing you again.
All right.